Hi there, fellow bio nerds. Today we're going to explore an example of fitness as it relates to cellular energetics. And specifically, we're going to talk about how plants have evolved alternative mechanisms to extract energy um, via photosynthesis if these plants live in hot and very, very dry climates. Um, these adaptations are there to battle dehydration, and that's a problem for land plants because it requires trades off with other metabolic processes, especially photosynthesis. Remember that plants um, get their CO2 through the stomata, the tiny openings under the leaves, but this is also where they would and this is where they expel oxygen, and this is also where they would lose water. So on very hot and dry days, plants will close their stomata because this is going to prevent them from losing water. It conserves water, but it also will limit photosynthesis. They won't be able to take up so much CO2, and they won't be able to get rid of the metabolic waste called oxygen. So oxygen will build up inside the leaves. These conditions favor an apparently wasteful process called photorespiration. And our favorite enzyme, rubisco, which is the enzyme that fixes carbon dioxide, um, actually does something else. It does something bad, really. So most plants, we call them C3 plants. The initial fixation of carbon dioxide via rubisco um, forms a 3-carbon compound. So the 3-carbon compound that is formed, that's where the name C3 plants comes from. But rubisco, the most important enzyme on earth, that's because that's the enzyme that fixes carbon dioxide and produces these 3-carbon sugars, can also bind to oxygen. So rubisco is not a very faithful enzyme. So in conditions where you have a lot of oxygen and very little CO2, rubisco will actually bind to oxygen instead of CO2 in the Calvin cycle. And it's going to produce a 2-carbon compound, a compound that plants can't use. They have no use for it. So this is an energetically wasteful product. So this is called photorespiration. Just like cellular respiration uses oxygen, this is why scientists call this process photorespiration. No energy is extracted from this process. This is a wasteful process. So rubisco really is a bad boy here. So photorespiration will decrease the photosynthetic output by actually consuming ATP, because those 2-carbon compounds need to be converted back into compounds the plant can use. Consuming oxygen, organic fuel, and it will release CO2 without producing any ATP or sugar. So it's really, really wasteful. So this photorespiration process happens to all plants. So C3 plants, which are by far the most common plants, will do that on occasion on days when it's really, really hot and dry. But then there are plants that actually do live in such climates where it's always hot and always dry. And those plants have evolved, have acquired adaptations that allow them to bypass this wasteful process called photorespiration. Now, why do we have this wasteful process? Well, think about it this way. Early Earth condition, there was actually very little oxygen in the atmosphere. So it wasn't a problem that rubisco was able to bind oxygen, because rubisco doesn't bind oxygen very well. It only binds oxygen when there's a lot of oxygen present. So this wasn't an issue because there wasn't much oxygen to begin with in the atmosphere. So it's believed that this is kind of a remnant, a relic from times when there wasn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere. Um, C4 plants is one type of plant that has evolved to live in hot, dry climates and has find a way to minimize the cost of photorespiration. They use additional metabolic pathways, they use additional enzymes to incorporate CO2. And what they do is a special enzyme which has very, very high affinity for CO2. It can fix carbon dioxide even when there's very little CO2 present. So this enzyme is different from rubisco. And it's different because it can actually bind to CO2 even when there isn't that much CO2. It will incorporate CO2 in 4 carbon compounds, 4 carbon sugars. That's why they're called C4 plants. And these compounds are then exported to different type of cell where they will release CO2, and that CO2 is going to be then funneled into the Calvin cycle. The other type of plants are called Chem plants. They're called Chem plants for crushylation, acid metabolism. No need to remember that name. Chem plants will open their stomata only at night when it's really the temperatures are not high, and they're going to incorporate CO2 into a type of organic acids. And then they're going to close the stomata during the day. And during the day, those organic acids are going to be turned back into CO2 and released into the Calvin cycle. So this is basically a summary of how the 2 different plants bypass this wasteful process called photorespiration. An example of a C4 plant is sugarcane. An example of a Chem plant is pineapple. Corn is also one such type of plant. And again, these plants are using additional proteins, additional molecules, additional enzymes, additional biochemical pathways on top of the Calvin cycle to overcome the wastefulness of Rubisco. So this is an example of how variation in the number and type of biological molecules increases fitness of an organism.